Howard Philip Lovecraft was born in 1890 and wrote speculative fiction simply as H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft is the undeniable father of the cosmic horror subgenre. Yes, he was probably a racist misanthrope with a lot of psychological demons, but he channeled his darkness into creating the Cthulhu mythos, which has captured the imagination of many readers, including myself, and influenced almost all writers in the horror genre that came after him, including Stephen King, Clive Barker, Poppy Z. Brite, and many, many others. Heck, several authors write exclusively in the Cthulhu mythos itself, like Brian Lumley and W.H. Pugmire. And of course, many horror films have delved into Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and I want to talk about them because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So, what is cosmic horror? Cosmic horror, or we can just call it Lovecraftian horror, envisions humanity as a little tiny blotch of life on this little dot of a planet called Earth, and compares it with the incomprehensible, malevolent, cosmic forces of the universe. If any one human tries to understand or somehow comes in contact with these forces, they are rendered insane by their own insignificance in the face of the vast primordial evil. Fun, right? I picked out 10 movies that are based on a Lovecraft work or strongly inspired by Lovecraft, and then sorted them by the tomatometer in Rotten Tomatoes, which is kind of interesting because some of the ratings were very strange indeed. Anyway, I don't pretend that I've seen every cosmic horror or Lovecraftian movie in existence, so this is just based on movies I have seen and have memories of or thoughts about. Let me know in the comments which Lovecraftian movie you remember the most, and while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. So, Fhtagn Cthulhu, let's get on with the list. Released in 1970, the Dunwich Horror received the lowest ranking of the videos listed here, garnering a tomatometer rating of 29, as well as an audience rating of 29. This film was meant to be the vehicle for actress Sandra Dee to break out of typecasting in her good girl roles. So, job well done. It also stars Dean Stockwell, who has been in a ton of television shows and movies, and most of you probably know him from Quantum Leap. At the time the film was made, there was a bit of a Lovecraft resurgence going on, which you can see in several Lovecraft-inspired episodes of The Night Gallery. The Dunwich Horror is, of course, based on the Lovecraft story of the same name, about Wilbur Whately, who was born under mysterious circumstances and searches for a complete copy of the Necronomicon at Arkham University and finds an opponent in the librarian who works there, a Professor Armitage, who refuses him the book. Oh, and in the movie he also has kidnapped a beautiful girl for unsavory occult purposes. The Dunwich Horror was, surprisingly for the time, more or less faithful to the Lovecraft story, at least in terms of the major plot points, but it didn't really work as a movie for one reason. It just wasn't scary. It also wasn't very suspenseful. The tone, at least for me, fell flat. Still, for Lovecraft fans, just for the nostalgia factor of vintage cosmic horror, it's an interesting movie to watch. I'm kind of sad that the Resurrected, released in 1991, isn't more well loved because I thought it was a really good adaptation. But it only has a 40% on the tomatometer and a 54% audience rating. It's adapted from Lovecraft's novel, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Interesting note about the novel, Lovecraft didn't think it was good enough for publication, so it was published posthumously. The Resurrected focuses on the wife of Charles Dexter Ward and the private investigator she hires to find out what her husband was doing that made him go mad. Apparently, he was a descendant of a mad alchemist and found his ancestors' diary. This captures the original story more than any other, and I think it is super creepy, thanks in large part to Chris Sarandon's performance as Charles Ward. In fact, the reason I think the movie is such a successful Lovecraft adaptation is because of how it captures the tone and moodiness and mystery of the original story. Yes, it's been modernized. There was no wife or detective in Lovecraft's original story. Instead, a doctor was doing the investigating, but still, I think this is a terrific movie that embodies the mood of Lovecraft's original writing. Oh boy, this next movie, In the Mouth of Madness, also is one of the few movies that captures the mood of Lovecraft's writing. But it only has a 57 on the tomatometer, but a much higher audience rating of 73. This is another masterpiece from John Carpenter, and it's not based on any specific work of Lovecraft, but the title does pay homage to Lovecraft since it references At the Mountains of Madness. It is about horror writer Sutter Kane, who goes into hiding. Kane is apparently the biggest name in the history of publication, bigger than Stephen King. That's what they say anyway. For reasons I'm not quite clear on, an insurance investigator is called in to search for Kane and bring back his next manuscript. Sam Neill plays the insurance investigator, and he is awesome. Anyway, the investigator gets drawn into a dark web as it becomes clear there's something not quite right about Kane's latest manuscript. Do people become psychotic killers after reading it? Is it a novel or is it a prophecy? This movie is gruesome, gory, and ultimately rises to cosmic horror proportions, even invoking the name of the old ones. I really think this is one of the best Lovecraftian horror movies, despite what the critics say. Dagon, released in 2001, is our next entry into cosmic horror. Now, here's what I don't get about Rotten Tomatoes. There's no way, in my opinion, that this is a better movie than The Resurrected or In the Mouth of Madness, but it has a score of 69% on the tomatometer and an audience rating of 56. This is a Spanish production, so I don't know any of the actors, but they give solid, though sometimes over-the-top performances. I will also say this movie has some of the better monster effects and scene design than most of the other movies. It is based on the Lovecraft short story, A Shadow over Innsmouth. In this interpretation, two couples on a yacht get caught in a freak storm and have to seek shelter in this weird little village that no one knows about. The village is, of course, the home of people who have mated with the deep ones, creatures of the dark ocean who worship the god Dagon. Okay, what my issue is with this movie is it goes from 0 to 100 in like the first 15 minutes of the movie. I really think it would have been more effective if the village didn't look like quite the horror nightmare the moment the main character enters. I would have preferred to slowly build it up and let the creep factor unfold, but instead we dial it up to 11 really fast and it stays there throughout the movie. Still, the monster effects and set design make it worth seeing. Continuing my shock and amazement at high Rotten Tomato scores is Die Monster Die, released in 1965. If you've seen it, please explain to me why it has a 71 tomatometer rating. You heard me, 71, but a more understandable audience rating of 39. Now, I picked this movie because I wanted to include an early Lovecraft adaptation, this one loosely based on The Color Out of Space, which I think is one of the best, if not the best, Lovecraft short story. It also stars iconic horror actor Boris Karloff in one of his later roles. It is about a strange meteor that lands near a small farm. In this version, the meteor causes plants to grow wild, so our farmer takes it into his greenhouse, thinking he's found a botanical miracle. But of course, the meteor has not so beneficial effects on people. I like the old school gothic horror moodiness, but overall, I found the movie a little bit on the bland side. I certainly think it should be in any list of Lovecraft films for its historical significance, but in my opinion, it maybe should be next to Sandra Dee's Dunwich Horror. But Rotten Tomatoes is what it is. And I wouldn't turn my back on Die Monster Die, even though its title is not only stupid, but doesn't make any sense for the movie. Now we start getting into the gory camp of 80s horror, starting with From Beyond, released in 1986. It has an 80% on the tomatometer and an audience score of 70. Again, this one is not based on a Lovecraft story per se, but draws from the mythos and certainly embraces cosmic horror. It also stars Jeffrey Combs, who you'll be seeing more of. Combs and Bruce Campbell sort of defined 80s camp Lovecraftian horror. In From Beyond, we have a scientist named Dr. Pretorius. If that name sounds familiar, it should, because it was the name of the over-the-top, flamboyant mad scientist in Bride of Frankenstein who seduces Dr. Frankenstein to return to his experiments. Anyway, the Dr. Pretorius here has created a machine that activates the pineal gland, which allows you to perceive other dimensions. Well, not only can you perceive other dimensions, you can interact with the horrific creatures you see, which is how Dr. Pretorius loses his head. His assistant is blamed for the murder, and the doctor who treats the assistant notices his pineal gland is growing, and an investigation ensues. Now, personally, I think the plot itself is kind of thin, but I love the idea of a machine that activates the pineal gland and opens a way to interact with other dimensions. If you like gory horror movies, this one may be for you. And there is a campiness that the actors bring, not that they are playing for laughs, but are embodying these over-the-top personalities for all they're worth, which is how to do camp. 80s camp continues with Evil Dead, released in 1983. I'm so happy critics recognize this movie as it has an 86 on the tomatometer and an audience score of 84. I mentioned Bruce Campbell before. Well, this is a movie that put him on the map. Now, I don't know how many movies before Evil Dead centered on a creepy cabin in the woods. I'm sure there must have been others, but this is the movie that solidified the cabin in the wood trope as a horror genre staple. Again, we have a movie not based on a specific Lovecraft story, but it does feature one of Lovecraft's most famous creations, the Necronomicon, the book that contains all the spells and rituals to contact the entities of cosmic horror. A group of young people stay in a cabin in the woods for a night of fun and games and find an old book. Yes, the Necronomicon. So they decide to read it out loud at night. Will any of them survive to the morning? Oh my gosh, this is another one of those movies we rented in college over and over. The camp factor is high, but so too is the gore. At the time, we had never seen anything quite so gory before. It was so over the top at times it was funny. The Evil Dead, of course, sparked a big franchise. I actually think Evil Dead 2 is a better movie, but it all started with the first one, Evil Dead. Now we're going to jump to a much more recent movie, Color Out of Space, released in 2019. It has a tomatometer rating of 86 and an audience rating of 82. If it sounds familiar, it's because it's the same story as Die Monster Die, and there was another movie based on Color Out of Space in the 80s called The Curse, starring Will Wheaton, that was really bad. So I didn't go into this expecting anything great, but this version did star Nicolas Cage, who has given some brilliant over-the-top performances in the past, so maybe I shouldn't have been surprised to find this was an awesome movie. Again, it's the same plot as Die Monster Die. A meteor lands near a farm that affects plant and animal life, and unfortunately for the family who lives at the farm, they suffer the same unfortunate effects. Everything about this movie is good in my opinion. The horror, the performances, especially Nicolas Cage, the absolute gonzo special effects. It's like being on a bad acid trip. All this makes this a truly spooky and memorable movie. Okay, this movie is really special. The Cabin in the Woods, released in 2011. It has a tomatometer rating of 92 and an audience rating of 74. If you haven't seen it, you've got to see it. I said before, Evil Dead put the horror trope of cabin in the woods on the map. Well, this movie takes that trope, turns it on its head, dismantles it, then turns it inside out and upside down. This is a cosmic horror masterpiece. Of course, it's not based on a Lovecraft story. It does pay homage to Lovecraft, but it also pays homage to other horror movie tropes. I was lucky enough to catch this on Netflix without hearing anything about it, so it completely blew my mind. So if you haven't seen it, I really don't want to spoil it for you. Let's just say it starts off as a typical cabin in the woods story about a group of attractive college friends going for a weekend of sex and drugs in a remote cabin in the woods. They get warned by a creepy guy at a gas station convenience store, but ignore him and go on their merry way to a weekend of gore and murder. Now, as their van approaches the cabin, there is a little clue that foreshadows this isn't your typical cabin in the woods horror movie, and it sure isn't. Oh my gosh, just go see it. That's all I have to say. I'm so happy that we're going to end with another camp 80s horror movie. Maybe the best of them all, Reanimator, released in 1985. It has a 94 on the tomatometer and an audience score of 82. This is another movie we rented over and over in college, and it is another retelling of the Lovecraft story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, the same as the Resurrected. Now, where the Resurrected followed the plot points of the Lovecraft story, Reanimator just uses it for inspiration because it really is not a retelling. It's also the movie that put Jeffrey Combs on the map. He plays Charles Ward, a medical student who thinks he can beat death in the form of a glowing green reagent he has been developing. He rents a room from another medical student who becomes a believer when Ward resurrects a cat. But no one else takes Ward seriously, certainly not the dean. Oh boy, is this a great movie if you love horror, especially campy horror. When I say camp, you may think comedy, and yes, the performances and the script are so over the top that there are many funny scenes, but it's not because they're really trying to be funny. It's because the actors are so committed to the roles in the script that they turn in these hilarious performances. Now, since Reanimator, there have been a lot of awful movies that purport to be Lovecraft movies. They see how popular these campy Lovecraft movies were and try to repeat it by making a comedy, and they're almost always disasters. Think of The Last Lovecraft, a really awful movie, or And I'm not kidding you here. The Call Girl of Cthulhu. No, just no. And I'll be completely honest, Reanimator may not actually technically be cosmic horror, but if you want to see a masterclass of what a camp horror should look like, go watch Reanimator. So those are my 10 Lovecraftian cosmic horror movies. Do you agree or disagree? Would you pull any of them off the list and replace them with something else? Let me know down in the comments. Now, this list didn't include any television series, but if it did, I would certainly have placed the HBO masterpiece Lovecraft Country at the top. Until we meet again, may all the movies you watch be...